This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series for critical animal studies scholarship from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. On today's episode, we're talking about animal history, and this is a topic that's well represented in the series. For example, the series include John Simon's 2019 book, Obèche, a hippopotamus in Victorian London, and Peter Tate's 2016 book, Fighting Nature, Travelling Menageries, Animal Acts, and War Shows. If these sound interesting to you, I encourage you to take a look at the Sydney University Press website. And I add that, unlike a lot of academic books, these are actually very reasonably priced. Now, before I introduce today's guest, I want to flag that this episode of Knowing Animals is a very special one, because it's actually a tie-in episode with the Journal of the British Academy, on whose editorial board I currently sit. A written version of this interview is going to be published open access in that journal, so please do keep your eyes open for that. And that might be particularly useful if you're listening to this episode and thinking, I'd love to add this book to reading lists or to a bibliography. You could add the written interview alongside the book and alongside this podcast. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Marcy Norton of the University of Pennsylvania's Department of History. She's a historian of the early modern Atlantic, interested in questions about how Europeans shaped the Americas and how Native American peoples shaped Europe. She's the author of the beautifully named 2008 book Sacred Gifts, Profane Pleasures, A History of Tobacco and Chocolate in the Atlantic World. But today we're going to talk about her 2024 Harvard University Press book, The Tame and the Wild, People and Animals After 1492. Welcome to the podcast, Marcy.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
So there's kind of two origins to this project. And one of them is something that I came across actually while researching that first book that you mentioned on tobacco and chocolate. And I was reading a source that is very well known to historians of this period. So I just want to emphasize it's not an obscure source. It is, in theory, an episode that many other people had read, but I've never seen it mentioned in the scholarship. And it actually opens up chapter 9 of my book. And it describes how in the island that is today Dominican Republic and Haiti, early on, like in the 1540s, there was an indigenous man who had escaped the oppressive conditions of, servitude with the Spanish, was living out in the wilderness. And he had basically adopted 3 feral pigs, which at this point there were many, many feral pigs because that population had exploded and introduced species, and had trained them to hunt other pigs. And then, it ends badly with them being killed by Spanish soldiers, and the man is utterly bereft, and the Spanish chronicler describes that and also his own confusion at it. And when I read this episode, I thought, what is going on here? Could this have even happened? If I can explain this, I feel like I can explain all kinds of things. So in some sense, that was the origins of it. And really, it did take me, 10 years plus and this book to explain that. But the other origin is one that maybe a lot more people can relate to, which is that in 2004, I had, as an adult, my first dog, Lily. And I was just mesmerized by the power of that relationship on so many levels. And at the same time, I was very aware of the intense suffering that humans inflict on animals, above all from maybe industrial agriculture. And, because I'm a historian, when something confuses me in the present, I want to understand its origin.
So central to your approach in Tame and the Wild is this idea of modes of interaction. So what are modes of interaction and why are they important?
Early on in the research, when I started looking at sources that describe European and indigenous ways of interacting with animals, I was just very struck by how different they were. And I wanted to find a way to write a history that didn't have any assumptions about, superiority, like notions of progress and a kind of neutrality to it. So so modes of interaction on the one hand was a kind of what I thought as a sort of neutral concept for comparing and then looking at the entanglement of them. But and so simply put, I mean, just to make it a little bit less abstract, the modes of interaction that I look at in Europe are hunting and husbandry, which those terms will be familiar to everyone. Probably less familiar are predation and familiarization, which are the ones I explore for Native America. But also, I from the get go, I was really interested in animal subjectivity, which lots of people are. But rather than approaching it as I think a lot of philosophers and scientists do about trying to sort of determine some you know a priori possibilities, I was curious about how cultural contexts determine what people are able to understand about animal subjectivity, seeing it as a relational thing. And modes of interaction allow me to do that.
I'm glad you raised this point about animal subjectivity because that's exactly what I was about to ask about. That's really one of the central threads of the book. And you're interested in, as I understand it, the extent to which animal subjectivity is recognized or not recognized in different modes of interaction. So you mentioned this distinction between European hunting and indigenous American predation. So could you introduce us to that distinction and tell us what these different modes of interaction tell us about animal subjectivity or perceptions of animal subjectivity?
Yes. So let me say, to start off in answering that question, that in fact, hunting and predation are probably where European and indigenous modes of interaction are closest. So it's, husbandry and familiarization where they're at their farthest. So that there's a lot of similarities as well as differences. So at the simplest level, hunting and predation are both what we would think as hunting. In both European hunting and indigenous predation, let me actually clarify here too, that the focus of the book in Native America is two culture areas, two macro culture areas. One of them is what scholars refer to as Mesoamerica. So that includes, central Mexico areas that were dominated by the Aztecs and Maya. So I focus on the central Mexico. And then what I refer to as Greater Amazonia, and an even huger area that would include the Caribbean from an indigenous perspective. So those are the regions that I'm talking, and I'm not trying to necessarily, suggest that these modes of interaction would also apply in other indigenous areas. Though from what I've read, there's probably some, resonance at minimum in those other areas. So basically, hunting and predation, among other things, refer to the practice humans have of hunting other animals. But I use different terminology because there are some really important differences. So in Europe, hunting was a collaborative act with other animals, above all, horses, dogs, falcons. And so that created a kind of mediated relationship to the prey, and also, of course, created intensely strong relationships between people and these what I term as vassal animals. In the parts of Native America that I'm looking at, predation was not mediated with these vassal animals. So there was a much more direct relationship to the prey. And so that produced different kinds of intersubjective relationships. So going back to your question about subjectivity, and so in both predation and in hunting, the prey is very much understood to be a fellow subject. And if you read, which I did, European hunting manuals from this period, what you quickly discover is that there are much of it is actually, dedicated to admiring the capacities of these animals, and pages, and often memorializing an individual animal, like a boar who was able to evade being hunted for years on end, in one case, and giving them nicknames and understood as individuals. And even more of the text is actually dedicated to discussing the capacities of these vassal animals as well, and what they're capable of doing. And so the subjectivity of these animals and the intersubjective relationship of those relationships just kind of jumps off the page in these hunting treatises that were written by hunters themselves. In Native America, and I should, right away say, like, as a historian working in these kinds of questions, there's a really asymmetrical nature of the sources, because for Europe, of course, we have the voices of the hunters themselves, whereas in this period, for indigenous perspectives, you're actually relying mostly on European sources. And so, we could talk about what goes into that. And there, what started to really jump out at me is how the mechanisms of hunting or predation themselves required the hunter to take on attributes of the prey who they were hunting. So that might mean vocalization, right, to attract the animal. And so learning basically how to speak whatever the language of the animal was. Things like camouflaging themselves within the environment. And so really understanding the habitat of the animal. So where we start to see a really important divergence, in addition to the, sort of not having the relationship with the vassal animals, is the way that the very experience of being a hunter requires a kind of transformative effect of becoming the animal. And so it changes the subjectivity of that hunter themselves. So that's sort of some, and maybe another way that I would talk about the differences between hunting and predation is that in both European hunting and indigenous predation, there is the idea that the prey predator relationship could flip around, right? That and that these hunting treatises often do mention times when hunters, were the ones who ended up getting eaten rather than vice versa. And that sort of adds, to the glamour and the stakes of it. But that notion that people could be prey as well as predators in the indigenous context is much more pronounced. And so this notion that, and that's partly why also I use the term predation, is that it's a much more contingent relationship, that there's no natural hierarchy really of prey and predator. And in fact, there are apex predators that go beyond humans, such as, jaguars and eagles, and that hunters themselves try to become like those apex predators.
Let me pick up on this idea of hierarchy, because when you're talking about these European, and I think especially Spanish and Portuguese hunting manuals, framing animals, hunted animals that is, as subjectivities, as having their own perspective on the world, that might be contrary to what we'd expect to see in early modern European sources. Is that correct?
You mean because you're thinking of a sort of like Genesis or classical notions of hierarchy of beings and those discourses?
Precisely, but also the hostility that we see in these early modern sources to the idea of animals having a perspective.
Yes, that tension is actually in the treatises themselves. So there will be times where there's almost in a sort of apologetic note when the hunter is admiring, the reason, like, saying like, oh, these animals definitely have reason, and then sort of correcting themselves and saying, well, not exactly reason, there is this sort of acknowledgement of that what they're observing and experience is a little bit at odds with other kinds of discourses in their culture. Yes, that's absolutely the case.
I remember as well you talk about how these differences between hunting and predation also extend to their relationship to warfare.
Yes. And that is, it's interesting because in both Europe and in the culture areas that I look at in Native America, hunting and warfare are understood to be very connected. And so, for instance, for European nobility, part of their claim to nobility, going back to the medieval period, is that they, and especially in Iberia, is that their ancestors participated in important warfare, and that their sort of identity as militarized heroes. And so again, the hunting treatises are very explicit about that hunting is kind of a surrogate for participating in warfare, and that part of, participating in the hunt is literally a performance of nobility, in the way that having certain kinds of dogs and access to certain kinds of grounds is restricted to nobility. But at the same time, there is also the notion that by participating in the hunt, they're preparing for warfare, and that there's and indeed that's the case, right? Because you're practicing your equestrian skills and so on. In Native America, there is that same idea that there's a connection between warfare and hunting, and that the practices are the same. But I would say it goes in some ways even further in the notion of seeing that the kind of prey could be human, or it could be animals as well. So that connection is even tighter in those regions.
One of the more memorable discussions in the book tied these questions of animal subjectivity to fears of witches and demons, both in Europe and among European colonists in the Americas. So what's going on there?
In order to answer that question, I need to talk a bit about definitely the most important mode of interaction in Europe, which is livestock husbandry. So we've been talking about hunting and the way that hunting was an intersubjective relationship between the hunters and the animals, but also that it's a relatively restricted activity, intentionally so, in Europe, whereas animal agriculture or livestock husbandry, and I can use those terms interchangeably, was pervasive, as it is today, right? I mean, we're heirs to that system, and animals in the context of animal agriculture were eaten, or, in the case of sheep, their fibers were used for transportation, just ubiquitous. And of course, it had very deep roots as well, it developed over millennia in Europe. And so, and let me just say, in this part of the argument, I'm flipping the way that a lot of scholars have talked about this. A lot of, the notion of animal objectification is out there, and people have, like famously Keith Thomas and Man in the Natural World has argued that kind of an anthropocentric worldview is what enabled people to, like mistreat animals and use them for their ends. And what I'm suggesting is that it's actually the mode of interaction of livestock husbandry that made that objectification is a result of that the technologies of that. And I focus particularly on the shepherd complex and also the slaughterhouse complex, and describe the ways that those create this separation between the consumer who, eats an animal or wears an animal, and the animal itself. And again, this will be very familiar to all of us today, because we, that logic is even, exponentially larger. But rather than seeing that as a product of industrialization, I argue that it actually has much, much deeper roots, and goes, and it was already well developed by the early modern period that I study. And so it developed, again, over centuries, if not millennia. Okay, where do witches fit into all of this? Despite all of these objectifying technologies, because of the presence of hunting, but also because animals, assert their subjectivity, despite these technologies and systems, people struggle with living in a system that objectifies animals and yet can't but help acknowledge the subjectivity of animals. So what I suggest is that demonology is a realm where people, perhaps not consciously, deal with these contradictions. And so starting with depictions of hell and demons going back to the Middle Ages, you see a kind of inversion of the human, non-human relationship, where it's humans who become the objectified animals, right? So in medieval depictions of hell, you see demons who, with poles, who are herding animals into an enormous, satanic maw that eats them. And then by the 16th century, such as in, Bruegel's Triumph of Death, you see even more analogous pictures of, the angel of death on a horse, like cowboys herding people. And so this becomes a way for people to sort of, work out their kind of nightmares about animals is a place where they're thinking about such activity. So that's on the European side. And then it very much connects later on in the book when I start exploring what happens when Spanish missionaries arrive specifically into what is today Mexico. And they are just basically, I think, unable to fully understand the kinds of relationships that people have with animals or the way that they think about animals. And they are so, and specifically the most, prominent missionaries who arrive in the 1520s are coming directly from the Basque country in, what is today northern Spain, where they were involved in witch persecutions. And part of their sort of missionary subculture involved reading these medieval treatises that talk a lot about witches turning into animals. So this is sort of an extension of the demonization thing, where then the people who are closest to animals in certain ways have these capacities to become animals. And so they impose this framework on indigenous cultures. And I don't think they're necessarily trying to distort it, but I just think they're not able to understand what's going on. And so part of the argument there is that quite a few of the ideas that start to that are attributed to indigenous people about animal transformation, quite a few of them actually have their origins in these European discourses.
So this connection, it feels almost Freudian, this connection between witchcraft and animality. Do you think that a fear of witches and demons would not have developed in a society that didn't have this fraught relationship with animal subjectivity? Or at least it might have evolved quite differently.
I mean, I wouldn't, I'll just, before I answer this question, I'll give you the caveat that the way people use witches is like really varies a lot. And so I think according to, some definitions of witches, it would not necessarily be, you could have witches and beliefs in witches without this. So I don't want to generalize about areas that I don't know, but I will say that I think the way that you are correct, that I do think that the way that demonology develops in Europe is utterly entangled with the way that people are interacting or not interacting with animals on a quotidian basis, that those things are inseparable. And the particular attributes of European demonology are very related to that.
You introduced the mode of interaction of husbandry, and you earlier contrasted that in passing with the mode of interaction of familiarization. So livestock is quite familiar to all listeners, I would imagine. And as you say, livestock practices in medieval Europe were not a million miles away from the ones that we know about today. But you want to sharply distinguish these livestock interactions from the familiarization interactions.
At the most simple level, familiarization is the practice of taking an individual wild animal and taming that animal. So whereas livestock husbandry is the way it develops in Eurasia is as a sort of consequence, not necessarily an inevitable consequence, but it has built into it the relationship of domestication, right? Of a suite of animals who have been domesticated and their primary existence is within that context of livestock husbandry. And here I'll make some distinctions between Amazonia and Mesoamerica, because the case in Amazonia is a bit more straightforward. So in Amazonia, there is no domestication of animals. And traditionally, and you can see this in popular works like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, scholars have either consciously or unconsciously seen that, even if I say the way I say it, lack of domestication as something is missing, that there's sort of a natural progress of human civilizations. And, again, this is like in children's textbooks, right? And domestication is one of those milestones, like a necessary growth spurt for cultures. And one of the things that I do in this book is I don't take that attitude, right? I have a neutrality about it. And once you have that neutrality, you start to see familiarization. So part of the reason I'm saying this is, and this goes back maybe to that first episode that I told you got me interested, like, could this man have tamed pigs? And that you might see where I'm going with this. Once I started to see lots and lots of examples of people taking individual wild animals and taming them, it's made utter sense that that pig story could be true. And so people have, scholars have been reading these sources for years, and no one has talked about familiarization. I'm talking historians. No historians have talked about familiarization because if they noticed it at all, it just seemed like, well, maybe they're on their way to domestication and they didn't quite get there. And you can see this kind of assumption too in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, when he says, like, that, he asked the question, like, why didn't they domesticate animals? And he concludes it's because the animals weren't suitable for domestication. And in asking a question like that, the assumption is you would domesticate animals if you could, right? And what familiarization shows is that there are some really good reasons to not domesticate animals. And one of those reasons, so to go back to familiarization, is if you take an individual animal, and let's say, you go on a hunt and you kill a monkey, and left behind are some baby monkeys. And you take that monkey back and maybe you eat the monkey, and then you take the baby monkey and you raise the monkey, and it becomes similar to what we would call a pet. And I don't use the word pet. I prefer the indigenous terminology. And then once that monkey, you name it, you talk to it, it imprints on you, you would never, ever eat that monkey, because the act of eating that monkey is sort of the quintessential act of taming and the familiarization. And that monkey is now your kin, it's your family member. So even though you might eat the parent or you might eat a relative of the monkey, it's the act of that taming that distinguishes it from that. So in this Amazonian system, the essence of familiarization is you don't eat who you feed, which is really the opposite of livestock husbandry, which is you eat who you feed. So that's just sort of an example of how, like, opposite and antithetical they are.
And so this is in some ways a story quite well told, but how does this understanding of familiarization help us understand the impact of the arrival of livestock farming with the Europeans?
So there's a lot of elements to what happens. And one of them is that I've repeatedly found in regions where Native people were able to retain a significant amount of autonomy, which is actually vast parts of the Americas in the early modern period. And just a little side note here about methodology is that our sources are very much biased in the direction of places where Native peoples don't have autonomy, because that's where you have a strong enough European, presence to be writing about it. So we have to take what little snippets we have about interactions where Native peoples are autonomous to get a sort of picture of what's happening. So with these sources, what I saw was a kind of divergence. Well, what I noticed is that in the scholarship that I had been educated with, that you've perhaps seen, Alfred Crosby's The Columbian Exchange, really well-known environmental historian, is that there had been a conflation of two things, which is the conflation of the process of European introduced species with the introduction of livestock husbandry as a system, or as I would call it, a mode of interaction. And so that indigenous people, on the one hand, were often really eager to adapt introduced species and had no trouble with many of the species of integrating those new species into the system of familiarization. Of course, the man and his three pigs is an example of that, right? Where he was able to take these feral pigs and treat them like any other animal. But the example that I saw over and over again, ranging across 500 years, was that of chickens. A huge enthusiasm for chickens, for their feathers and bringing them into the fold. But once the chicken was sort of part of the family unit, then you wouldn't eat chickens. And I think part of the reason we have quite a bit of documentation on that is that was really shocking to European observers. Like, why would you not eat a chicken? Or sometimes they would say, well, we wouldn't even eat an egg, and that was just extremely strange. And so while there would be this enthusiasm for introduced species, the idea of livestock husbandry produced a real revulsion for the reasons that I've already suggested. Like in a system where you don't eat who you feed, livestock husbandry doesn't make any sense. And so, the Europeans who observed it would actually, present this as a sort of form of sloth and laziness and couldn't understand it, rather than understanding, the sort of cultural logic that was at the heart of it. Now, there were regions where native groups, lost their autonomy and were under European rule. And in those regions, really, people didn't have a choice but to adopt livestock husbandry. And I should say it was actually forced on them, in the sense that they were, made to participate in ranches, give their labor to it. So there were all kinds of mechanisms. And now I'm thinking more of central Mexico. This is where I really, focus on that. And also, a second generation of indigenous people living under European rule, it would also become sort of normalized. You do see, and, by then that becomes part of their landscape as well. And so there's and they want to compete in that context. But part of what I examine in there is the kind of cultural effects that the incorporation of animal husbandry has. So in a lot of historians, when they focus on sort of cultural changes to indigenous communities, they look at things like religion, the forced adoption of Christianity. But because animal husbandry is often seen as sort of political economy, and it's not seen as part of actually changing, kind of belief systems and its cultural effects. And that's something that I explore as well.
I was really struck by your recurring discussions of how the modes of interaction of the indigenous Americans influenced European conceptions and practices as well. So there's lots of talk about the development of zoology and other scientific disciplines. But what I really wanted to ask you about was the emergence of pet keeping in Europe after encounters with indigenous Americans.
As I mentioned already, when I refer to these tamed animals, I don't use the word pet because, as you said, pet in English and other languages doesn't even appear on the scene until later on. And so I do see the modern pet as developing out of the sort of entanglement of European vassal animals, and then also their exposure to these tamed animals, which one of the indigenous terms is Yegwe. That's a Kalinago word. Those are people who live on the island, the Eastern Caribbean, such as the island of Dominica. Starting actually on October 12th, 1492, which is when Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas, Europeans became enmeshed within familiarization practices. And this has to do with practices, of course, that predate European arrival, where gifts of tamed animals were ways that indigenous communities created bonds of alliance and kinship between them, functioning sort of similarly, actually, to how, a marriage might bring two communities together. The gift of a tame parrot, for instance, to another community, or a tame monkey, would be a way to bring these communities together. Actually, and I'm going to say as an aside here, because I realize I haven't mentioned this already, I haven't given people a sense of the diversity of tamed animals who could be encompassed in these familiarizing practices. So monkeys and parrots appear probably most frequently in the sources, and I think that has to do with their kind of portability, something that I'll come back to in a second. But every kind of animal that you could imagine appears. Basically, almost any animal that can be hunted could also be a familiarized animal. So I have examples of a manatee, peccaries, tapir, various kinds of rodents, including capybara, all kinds of birds like a toucan, owls, iguana, just a huge diversity of animals. And one other little note I want to make about familiarization is that I mentioned that historians hadn't written about familiarization before. And so when I started noticing it, I thought, like, no one's ever observed this. But then I started reading anthropological literature, and ethnographers have been talking about it, for a long, long time. So there's kind of an interesting disciplinary split there. So just a side note about that. So anyway, back to the entanglement of European and indigenous modes of interaction with familiarization. So because of these pre-existing practices around familiarized animals, Europeans were kind of immediately on the receiving end. So that October 12, 1492, Columbus was gifted a parrot. And I think, the intention there was like to make these weird, hairy strangers into allies. So the Europeans who arrived, like Columbus, were very excited about these parrots. They were coming from cultures that had traditions of court menageries, and since the Middle Ages and even before, back to classical times, the way that really powerful kings and popes would show their prestige was by having these menageries of exotic animals. So there was a kind of meeting point where there was both a desire for these exotic animals on the European parts, and then indigenous people were, ready to gift them with a different set of intentions. So very, very early on, parrots start being brought back in in large quantities, and some monkeys as well. And these individual animals who were brought back were themselves products of, familiarization, of taming practices, of really skilled expertise to make them. And the big kind of difference between familiarized animals and court animals, or even vassal animals, was that the purpose of familiarized animals is to basically provide pleasure. The pleasure, the same in this sense, similar to pets, right? The pleasure of companionship, of giving and receiving companionship. And whereas those kinds of bonds might be products of the vassal relationship, the relationship that a hunter might have with his dog or his horse, that was sort of an effect of it and not the purpose of it. And so my suggestion is that Europeans' exposure to familiarization, where this love and companionship is an end in itself, helps explain the timing and the emergence of pets that hadn't previously existed in Europe.
Let me ask about methods. So in your introduction, you talk about finding animals in the margins, which is an idea that I think will be familiar to lots of animal historians and many academics in the wider animal studies world. But let me really push you on this. It's one thing to find, to take some of your sources as examples, animals as peripheral figures in pictures, or to learn about animals from early dictionaries. But do you feel we can or could or should recover animal voices and animal agency from these margins? Or to put it another way, how, if at all, can we capture the voices, literally or figuratively, of the early modern animals themselves?
So I'll say that in some sense was not my object in this book. And I would say I would characterize my approach as a kind of humble anthropocentrism, which it means that I don't want to overreach what seems to me epistemologically and phenomenologically possible, and that there's a kind of arrogance. I mean, I enjoy, for instance, fiction that tries to sort of occupy like the animal perspective, but I think there's a real risk in sort of absorbing the animal into like a kind of human consciousness. And so that's just a kind of, position that I occupy, maybe philosophically, but even more so methodologically with sources that I don't think allow us to access that. However, I am really interested in that doesn't mean I'm not interested in the animal experience or animal agency, but the sort of terrain that to me seemed not really investigated was humans' ability, as you sort of said in your at the beginning, is in humans' ability to be sensitive to forms of animal subjectivity. And that is the thing that I was trying really, that was my prey, in this book, is the possibility, human sensitivity to different kinds of subjectivities. And so that I feel like, as I've already said, the nature of the sources are wildly asymmetrical. And in order to kind of give a picture that appears symmetrical, I had to use very different methodologies in the different sections.
I'm glad you mentioned your own philosophical position, because that ties very neatly to how I wanted to close this part of the conversation, because I wanted to reflect a little on your epilogue. Both, I think, because it's something that will be of particular interest to listeners of this podcast, and because I see that this has shaped the way that some of your reviewers and commentators have responded to the book. To put it simply, I suppose the epilogue shows that you're not aiming for a detached work of historical scholarship here. Instead, your epilogue paints a bleak picture of our current relationship with animals, or perhaps I should say our contemporary modes of interaction with animals. And it shows that you want to push contemporary commentators on human-animal relationships to recognise the origins of these relationships in the early modern period. So how would you tie, in broad terms or in specific terms, the kind of scholarship you're doing here to contemporary questions about our relationships with animals?
Well, I think it is bleak, but I actually think, I also want to emphasize that I think there is some sort of little tiny bit of maybe optimism in it, which was, I'll start to answer this by talking about a conversation I had with a friend's 12-year-old child a number of years ago, a very precocious child. They were telling me that there was nothing to be done about the way that we treat animals, that, that factory, people were going to eat meat, and factory farming was just the way it was. And they saw no other way. That's how it had always been. And I, pushed back and I said, really, this is not how it's always been. And actually, in the history of humanity, these practices are just really the blink of the eye, and that animal agriculture is a very, to sort of, to use what's almost become a cliche among historians now, to provincialize animal agriculture. But also it sort of goes two ways, to recognize the degree to which animal agriculture has created so many of people's assumptions, cultural assumptions. So it goes beyond just the enormous suffering it creates to 92 billion animals a year around the world, and the environmental degradation that goes along with it, but also that it creates this sense of inevitability and necessary. And so I think if there's one contribution that I hope my book has, is to show that that is not the case. We could see this as almost a deviant path that people have taken, and along with those assumptions is the idea that people think it's somehow more natural to have an instrumental relationship with animals than a non-instrumental relationship of animals, or one that's, that it's more natural to have an objectified relationship than one that recognizes the subjectivity. And I think, I think to have things change, a lot of things to happen. So I don't think, there's going to be one book or many books actually, because obviously I'm not the only one working in this way, but that's not going to change things overnight. But I think it's part of the equation to help people see the sort of, I think one of the really positive things history can do is open our imagination for ways of being when we see the particularity of one way of being seems like the only way of being. And that's just not true, historically.
Now, Marcy, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I struggle a little bit with this because I think I started systematically reading a whole lot all at once I got interested in the topic. But I do think before I started the project, I had read J.M. Kitsey's Lives of Animals, where he sort of takes on the Peter Singer perspective. So I might say that one really struck out for me, kind of even in a fictionalized form, putting forth some of the views of animal scholars and philosophers.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So I wrote an essay in a volume called Lexicon of the Hispanic Baroque, Transatlantic Exchange and Transformation, where I first outlined my ideas about modes of interaction. So it actually, a different essay called Going to the Birds, which also explores these ideas in a preliminary way, actually appeared in print first, but it was the lexicon one that I wrote.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think the philosopher Cora Diamond was really important to me. Her essays, Eating People, I guess, if I'm remembering the title correctly. I think that really helped me in thinking about modes of interaction and how practices create ideas rather than vice versa.
It's very funny. One of the first marginal notes I wrote when I was reading your book was Cora Diamond, when I saw something that felt very Diamond-esque. So
Okay.
it's interesting to hear there was that influence there. That's very nice.
Yes, definitely.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I don't know what the most important thing is. I think I only know what I thought I could do. So I'll speak to that, which is what I've said already, which is showing the sense of possibility that things don't need to be the way that they are by looking at things that we see as inevitable, had a very contingent past.
If you could change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
And animal agriculture.
Good, I like that answer. What are you working on next?
Right now I'm thinking about forests and different ways of being in and with forests. I guess you could say it's a bit of a synthesis of the first book on tobacco and chocolate and the animals, like thinking about these as sort of systems and kind of indigenous and European ways and how they become it.
And how could people find out more about your work?
Google me and my pen profile will pop up and my titles.
Well, thanks so much, Marcy, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X, on Instagram, or on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.